But anyway, so last time we were in the trines. I was explaining the trines, and now we're into squares. So the square also answers a lot of questions, like the trine. The trine in the birth chart, for example, shows us where things come easy to us. But in order to advance in life and to find often success, we need to work with the square. The square is a very tense aspect, but like a good example would be a person working out at the gym. It tenses the muscles, but at the same time, the result is that you're much more healthy and in shape. It's sort of something like that. It's a difficult aspect to deal with, but the more you deal with it, the more you find solutions, and the more often success you could find in life, or the more you could move forward in life into the world. So now with the square, we're dividing the grid, the major arcana. We're dividing the major arcana into 4, but the 22 cards or 21 cards of the major arcana doesn't divide into 4 like the 3 did with the 21 cards, minus the Trump Fool, which acts more like a background godlike card, let's say a Trump-like card. But in the case of the 4, we're already finding that it's difficult in a way. It's already proving itself to be the difficult aspect in that it doesn't divide perfectly by 4. So the closest multiplication of 4 within the major arcana is the number 20. And when we break that grid into 4, we find very fast that it breaks down immediately after the second line. The numbers don't follow themselves as well, so we have to immediately... That's why in the earlier videos I was showing how the grid has to be put into a circle, because that's where everything makes more sense. So when we put the square aspect into a circle, you'll find that it wraps around nicely over the chart with only one card overlapping, but that card is not a problem. It actually answers a lot of vital information about how it works, which I'm going to explain soon enough. So in the earlier video I was showing how the zodiacal wheel breaks down into 4 90 degrees aspects, which show the learning cycle, starting with the spontaneous act, the reaction, the observation, and then the control, which could be translated into an example of the child that spontaneously touches the element of an oven. The reaction is to pull his hand away. The observation is that the element is hot, is dangerous, and the control is not to touch the oven anymore. That's sort of a simplified, lower octave understanding of that learning cycle. So here I'm showing how the square configuration shows how with 21 major issues, 21 major archetypal issues, with this square configuration, we could systematically understand how to move through the issue at hand and how to solve it. And so when we start putting the cards in those 4 cusps of these quadrants, that's how we could conceptually deal with many of life's obstacles, by looking at which archetypes fit within those 4 quadrants, the 4 cusps of these quadrants, or the 4 cardinal points of the zodiacal wheel. It's guidance as to how to resolve these 21 major, let's say, or more prominent archetypal issues, these 21 more prominent issues that face us in human life generally. So to come back to Socrates, Socrates also asked a lot of questions, like in his book The Republic, he asks a lot of questions about justice and what is justice, and he finds simple solutions that we saw already in the past. Like in the Trine, we saw that it was the wise leader. Justice involves a wise leader looking over the masses, but you get more in-depth answers when you look at the square configuration. The square provides information on the difference between what feels right and what really is right, what works and what doesn't work. For example, through this process, this square configuration, many issues that we face, many big issues, many, let's call them archetypal issues, because they repeat themselves over and over again. Many of those issues could be maybe not answered, but we could be guided in the right direction as to how to solve that issue. What's standing in the way of resolving the issue often is also shown, and what the final resolution, what the final conclusion as to how to solve that issue, or how we could begin to go about how to solve those issues, such as justice or inner knowing, wisdom, finding inner strength, finding our moral compass, finding earthly power, political power, finding a mate, attracting a lover, talking to God, communing with the divine, finding control, order in life, accessing health, accessing better health, finding transcendence, mastering a craft, accessing our vital power. Basically, the answer, how this works, is that the observation here is the issue in question, is the observation. So that's the issue at hand. So whatever we're seeking to solve, we put that card in the observation, in that part of the quadrant. Like the child touching the oven, the observation is that the oven is hot. The oven is dangerous and it's hot. If you do the same thing with the major arcana and you just put what you want as an answer over observation, and then every card will follow in its place. So just to give an example of like Plato's quest for justice, if you overlay these cards with justice as observation, the spontaneous act, and then the card that overlaps here would be the shadow to that spontaneous act, which I'll explain very soon, the reaction, and then the overall answer to how to achieve justice is in this card right here, which is in the control. So just to give an example, when Socrates was seeking justice, he was doing so in a conscious way. Whatever we're seeking after, this is generally the spontaneous act, that the act that we naturally, without thinking, the act that we approach that question with. That's how we approach the question of justice, usually with a conscious approach. Most people in your everyday life don't ask, what does justice mean and what is justice? Usually when you're asking about justice, it's a very conscious act. You have to have a very conscious mind to ask that question in itself, if you will, right? So the spontaneous act is it's the natural act that whatever is at issue here, that's usually the human natural act without thinking. This is how we approach it. The shadow of which is an elevated consciousness, but too elevated. Like there's a negativity to the shadow card here, so there's a too much elevation or too much idealism behind the search for justice. So when we're seeking justice, we're doing so consciously, but often in a very idealistic way. Just like Socrates was very idealistic about it. He thought he could create this perfect community, this perfect city ruled by philosophers, and everything would be perfect, right? That was sort of his overly idealized approach to it. The reaction is this, exactly what I was talking about. The reaction is like a make-believe utopia, because you have the two people in the Garden of Eden there. The reaction is sort of like a make-believe utopia, a sort of infantilization. Like Adam and Eve were sort of like infants in a way, right? The way they were naked in the Garden of Eden and no agency of their own, so it's sort of infantilization. So usually the spontaneous act and the reaction are a bit more negative, let's say, when it comes to the question. We'll see them in a bit of more of a negative light, because the answer, how to control it, is control. So it's usually seeing that it's 180 degrees from reaction and 90 degrees from spontaneous act. That means that they don't get along that well. So the control is sort of more the positive end to that question. But it doesn't mean that everything else is negative, but it tends to be more like it doesn't find the answer, but it's getting us along towards the answer. So the spontaneous act gets us, like, basically, if you want to know what justice is, you have to first be conscious, have a very conscious mind to just ask the question itself. So it's not negative per se. It's just what will be more negative is that shadow card that's behind the spontaneous act shows us what negative sort of shadow part of that. So when it comes to Socrates asking about justice, it's a very conscious question, but also the shadow behind that consciousness is that it's too elevated. There's too much ideology behind it. There's too much idealism. And the search for justice itself requires too high of an idealism, if you will, right? Everybody that's ever looked for justice is basically looking for something really high, looking for some kind of utopia. And you see that in the reaction when we see the Garden of Eden, which is the highest utopia imaginable, as the Garden of Eden, right? Where everything's provided, where we don't have to think about anything, where God provides us with everything we want. So in a way, it's a sort of it's like living in your parents' house. Is sort of infantilization, where you don't have to do anything and everything is given to you. That's sort of the reaction. So Socrates, when he's looking for justice, that the automatic reaction to this elevated question is what he's seeking. Basically, is a utopia of kinds. But that's not the reality. And here we're shown that the actual control to how to solve this issue of justice is sort of the opposite. It's not a utopia. It's a falling down from this fake world we've built, this corrupt world that we've built for ourselves. Usually in our, let's say, as for an individual in his own psyche, this corrupt system that we've built in our own psyche. True justice is to be taken down from that. To find true justice is to basically fall from our high, from the places we've put ourselves on high. The justice, really what it is, it's a punishment, if you will, where we fall from on high in order to learn real lessons, where what has become corrupt and what has become corrupt within our own psyches falls from on high in order to rebuild from a stronger foundation. So basically, to find true justice, we first have to be taken down a peg. Like when you're 20 years old at university, that's the best place to indoctrinate people, because that's often, around that age when you're seeking that utopia, you're seeking true justice, and you think the reaction is utopia, this paradise, but it's a false paradise. We're shown here that eventually most of us, when we go into our 30s, we realize that true justice is actually the tower. We have to come down from this high place that we've built for ourselves and start back from the foundation, if you will. True justice, we eventually find out, is more of a destructive process. It's destructive at first in order to reconstruct. And that's what the tower, in its most positive sense, that's what the tower symbolizes. It's basically, the tower is very much an editing card. It represents editing. So to edit, we must first scratch out what no longer works, like trim out the fat, as they say, in order to rebuild what is true and to allow the higher order to emerge. Why I'm starting with justice, and also why I think Socrates and all the ancient philosophers were often seeking for justice, is because it very much links to the times we're in right now. We're still in those times when we're desperately seeking justice. We're desperately seeking true justice. And what's really going on is that a higher order is trying to emerge. But first, in order for that to happen, there must be an editing that takes place. There must be a taking down of things that no longer serve us in order to rebuild what really truly serves.